think we're going to do a round two of what we covered last week. So you can get out your books. We'll be on chapter 8, text 1. In terms of an introduction, and the reason we're going to go over it again is I think that the subject matter is intricate enough that it requires a second look if you guys are going to digest it. As far as how we got here, Krishna really introduced a theology in the 7th chapter. And theology, again, is a philosophy that includes God. So, and in terms of a philosophy, you have to look at the world, so you have to have a concept of world, and you also have to look at yourself. When I say self, I don't literally mean look at yourself in the sense of personal introspection, such that you might do in psychoanalysis. I mean introspection, looking within in the sense of who am I? What does it mean to be a conscious living being in this world? How am I different from this world? How am I the same as this world? And so philosophers are just like everybody else in that they're looking at the world and trying to make sense out of it. And so any philosophy has to have a concept of world, all the stuff you see when you look around, and the concept of self, who we are. If looking at the world and self leads you to the conclusion that there is a transcendent source, a spiritual source of existence, now you have a theology. Because now, in addition to the world and a concept of us, you also have reached the conclusion that that would require a creator, a person behind the creation. And so in that case, you have a theology. Now, the Gita is a theistic text from the beginning. Krishna almost immediately introduces himself as the focal point of devotion. But the verses that do that are few and far between in the first 6 chapters or so in the Gita. And so Krishna says, Buddhau Sharanam Anvicha, strive for taking shelter of Buddhi, but that term, taking shelter of, is kind of a precursor to theism. He says, Yukta Asita Matpadaha, sit with me as the highest object. That's much more overt in terms of theism. Mayi Sannyasya Adhyatma Chetasa, you should give everything to me. Mayi Sarvani Karmani Sannyasya Adhyatma Chetasa, you should surrender everything to me in spiritual consciousness. That's definitely spiritual. And so, but it gets even more overt. I mean, as the chapters go on. Bhoktaram Yagyatapasam Sarvaloka Maheshwaram. I'm the enjoyer and the master of everything. And then Suhridam Sarvabhutanam, I'm the well-wishing friend of all beings. Yatvamam Shantim Richati, one who understands this. After having known this, you achieve peace. And then Yoginam Api Sarvesham, of all the yogis, Matkaten Antaratmana, one who within themselves makes me the goal. Shradhavan Bhajate Yomam, and worships me with devotion. Samayukta Tamo Mataha. He is considered to be the most yogad to me. He's considered to be the most yogad to me. So as you go through the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th chapters, I skipped chapter 4, but Krishna says in chapter 4, Janma karma shime divyam, my appearance and actions are all transcendental. And then evam yo veti tatvataha, one who knows this in truth. Evam yo veti tatvataha. Yat punar. Now I'm forgetting verses. Tyaktva deham punarjama naiti mameti sojana. One, after leaving this world, you don't take birth again. And then verse like yeyata mam prapadyante tangs tajaiva bhajamyaham. That everyone is, as you surrender to me, I reciprocate with you. And then paritranaya sadhunam vinashaya chaduskritam, to save the pious and annihilate the miscreants. Dhamma samstapanartya sambhavami yuge yuge. I appear in this world yuga after yuga to reestablish Dharma. Those are 3 verses just from the 4th chapter. So you'll find verses in every chapter of the Gita that designate Krishna as God, that differentiate him from us, that designate him as being superlative and the creator of the universe and the cynosure of the universe. So theism is never too far away. But in the 7th chapter, Krishna explains that the whole world is his energy, and then the souls are his superior energy. And that if you look in the world, you get the fragrance of the earth and the taste of water. These are all manifestations of his glory, and that we can't appreciate him fully because we are enraptured by the gunas. But he stands above the gunas, and by taking shelter and surrendering to him, you'll also pass beyond the gunas. That people in times of need will take shelter of him, but some people never take shelter of him. And even if you explore other types of religion where you surrender to, let's say, a demigod or a oneness, you feel a oneness in the universe, those are small parts of his glory. And so you really get in the 7th chapter, the whole chapter are like the highlight verses from the other chapters. The whole chapter is about Krishna and his connection to us, his connection to the world, bhakti, devotion, etc., etc. And so towards the end of the chapter, he then introduces 6 terms. What are those 6 terms? In no particular order. Try and remember one of them. 6 terms. Brahma. Brahma. Good. All right. We got 1. Brahma. Good. 2. Atma. No. Aniruddha. No. Adhyatma. All right. We got 2. By the way, a Sanskrit word that starts with doesn't qualify. So you just don't think of any term you can think of that's not going to get you the win here. There's 6 terms he introduces. They're actually 6 words. So it's like you just get to say, can you imagine if I was to introduce terms like ontology, which is a philosophy of what exists. Just like I said, philosophy, a theory of world, and self. That would be called an ontology. And then you said obstetrician. What would people think of you in a philosophy class if somebody did that? Or abdomen. You know what I mean? You follow? And so just coming up with a term. All right, so we have not Atma, but Adhyatma. Great. Adhyatma and Brahma. We got 2 out of 6. Let's go, guys. By the way, this is the evidence I need to give the same class again, because you guys can't even remember the 6 terms that were introduced. What to speak of being able to understand how they connect with one another. Yes? Purusha. No. The term Purusha did occur in one of the verses we read in the 8th chapter, but that was not one of the 6 terms that was introduced. Purusha is introduced in the 13th chapter as a term to be defined, but we're not in the 13th chapter, we're in the 8th chapter. Adidaiva. All right. We got Adidaiva. Adhyatma, Adidaiva, Brahma. We're halfway there. Let's keep going, guys. Huh? Adibhuta. All right, good. Adibhuta. Adibhuta would mean of the Adibhuta, but okay, that's fine. So Adibhuta, good. Adiyagya. All right, we got 5, and we got one last one. It's the most difficult one to remember of all of them. Karma. Yeah, there you go. Boom. And so the chapter starts out, and Arjuna says, Kim Tat Brahma, what is that Brahman? Kim Adhyatma, what is Adhyatma? Kim Karma, what is karma? Purushottama, there's Krishna's name. So, and actually, Aniruddha is also another name of Krishna. So you're just basically just coming up with names of Krishna as if they count. Adibhutam Chakim Proktam, what is declared to be Adibhuta, and then Adidaivam Kimuchate, and what is Adidaiva, and then Adiyagya Katam Kotra Dehe Asmin Madhusudana. Who is the Adiyagya, and how is he within the body? Prayanakale Chakatam Gyeyo Asi Niyad Atma Bihi. And how can that Adi Yagya be remembered at the time of death? By those who are self-controlled. So the Adi Yagya, now the Adi Yagya could be, if it's within the body, it could either be the individual soul or God. But when you start to get into this, how can he be remembered at the time of death? By those who are self-controlled, it starts to lean in the direction of it's talking about God. And in the previous chapter, Krishna said, you can remember me at the time of death. Therefore, that linkage between the last chapter where these terms were introduced first and this chapter where Arjuna's question reflects that he's understood what Krishna said in the last chapter where Krishna said, you'll be able to remember me, that makes it pretty clear that the Adi Yagya is Krishna. I'm going to say that again. You guys didn't follow it. But I did make sense when I was speaking, but you guys are spacing out. And this isn't a class where you guys can space out. In general, not a good idea to space out. But in this class in particular, it's going to make it really tough on you. In the 7th chapter, Krishna says, and by understanding all these points, you will be able to remember me when you die. What's happening in the 7th chapter, by the way? What's different about the 7th chapter compared to the other 6 chapters? Go.
It's introducing bhakti.
It's introducing bhakti. Nope, bhakti is in every single chapter. I mentioned that in great detail in the last 10 minutes. Yes.
It's establishing a theology.
Bingo. Is talking about bhakti the same as establishing a theology? No. The answer is no. Therefore, you attempting to paraphrase what I said and not sticking to exactly what I said is problematic. Because I wasn't saying something that you could paraphrase lazily and get right. A theology is different than something about bhakti. Something about devotion and worshiping God is different than laying out a theology. What is a theology, by the way?
A relationship between the world, God, and himself.
Bingo. A philosophy that also includes God. Now, why would looking at the world and having a philosophy of the world and a philosophy of self, how would it result in you believing in God? This is an open-ended question that I haven't answered. Everything up till now, all my questions, I've already given you the answers for. This one I haven't given you the answer for. Let me say it again. How is it that by looking at the world, one would conclude that God exists such that your philosophy, explanation of self and world, would become a theology, explanation of self and world as coming from a creator? It's an open-ended question. You just have to answer the question. It's not like, what do I think? It doesn't matter what I think. This is an open question that I haven't given you the answer for. Go.
Because we see that consciousness exists in this world, and it doesn't seem that consciousness can come from matter, and so therefore consciousness would have to come from something separate or distinct from matter.
What was your answer?
It was similar to saying when you establish that and say that everything that exists around you is coming, say for instance, a particle from the creation. If you are a part of that creation, then you're also coming from the same source.
why couldn't there be a physical cause of creation, like a Big Bang?
Because after that, how and why the Big Bang happened?
By chance, or
that
just...
chance is exactly the particle from which creation is happening. Like the same way.
But a particle that creation happened from by chance would not necessitate a creator. A creator is a transcendent being, a deity.
Yeah.
The fact that everything came from somewhere doesn't necessarily mean that somewhere that everything came from is necessarily God.
But that's how.
Slow down.
No.
It's okay. I want to hear what you say, but you're not listening to me. You're too attached to what you want to say to listen to me rebutting what you're saying. I want to hear what you say, but you have to, it's unfortunate, but when you have a debate, which is what we're having, you have to listen to the person who's talking and arguing with you, at least so that you can understand their argument in order to be able to overcome it. So everything came from somewhere. That somewhere could be a Big Bang, a singularity, an infinitely dense but infinitesimally small ball of matter that then exploded and created the manifest cosmos. It could have happened by chance. Chance does not indicate a personal creator. In fact, chance means there's no creator. Like when you flip a coin, it's heads and it's tails, and that's by chance. Nobody goes, oh, there's a God who's making that coin become heads or tails. That would be preposterous. That would be foolish. To conclude that when you flip a coin that has a chance of landing on heads or tails, that it must be a God who's making it land on heads or tails, that would be ridiculous, because the very nature of chance is that that is a sufficient explanation for what exists. Did you follow that? Back to you.
That's where I take back what I was saying, because I was beginning from the top.
But you weren't taking back what you said. You were just arguing with me. And so you got to slow down enough. I want to hear from you. I want you to win. If I'm arguing against theology and you're arguing for it, I want you to win. But your argument has to be strong enough to win, at least at like a high school level. You follow? Go. You're good. I appreciate the exchange. You're good.
When the world itself is incomplete in describing the universe, that is a simpler kind of...
You're on to something. You just said it extremely poorly.
Yeah.
Do you think you've said it well?
No.
You did. That was terrible. You want to try again?
I don't know if I can say.
I mean, you have something to say. You have to try to say it. Go again.
When your description of the world and of the self is incomplete in describing everything, then you necessitate God.
That was way better than what you said before. I'd say what you said before was an F, and that was a D. But that's a big jump. A D passes. You follow? What you want to say is when you're attempting to explain what exists in the world and chance is insufficient because there are facets of reality that you can point to which could not have come into existence without any either fine-tuning in the case of the world, or there's an irreducibility to consciousness. So when I explain self, I find that consciousness has features that you can't find within matter, and therefore the idea that consciousness comes from chemistry no longer works. Alternatively, when I look at the world, and the world is fine-tuned enough, such like, for instance, if you were to look at hieroglyphs on a cave wall, right? There is a sufficient amount of complexity in those hieroglyphs, such that they could not have arisen by, let's say, wind. You follow? There's a significant amount of complexity, but sometimes nature gives rise to complexity, but then there's also specificity in terms of what was created. And at a certain point, the specificity and the complexity of something indicates that it was created by a person as opposed to created by natural forces. So clouds that look vaguely like animals, or let's say faces in the rocks, those don't freak us out because they seem like they could have arisen by natural chances. But at a certain level of complexity, hieroglyphs or whatever it might be, there's enough specificity and complexity where it indicates that those things did not arise by chance. And so it's really what you said. You gave one specific example, that consciousness is irreducible, consciousness can't come from matter, therefore I have to have a conscious source of reality because consciousness is an irreducible facet of reality. That's one way to argue it from looking at self. You could also get there by looking at the world and seeing intentionality and fine-tuning in the world, the anthropic nature of creation that's made to support life. You follow? And so you could even say life itself, devoid of consciousness, but life always entails some degree of consciousness, but life itself with its extremely complicated DNA. And you could look at the complexity of DNA required to make life, and you could say that can't arise by chance. You can actually quantify it. You make that argument. That even life itself defies a material explanation. In fact, we don't find life arising from chemicals. We don't find life arising from matter. We find that only life comes from life. And therefore the argument that ultimately life came from matter is not supported by any evidence we find in the world, which is that life always comes from life. So there's a number of ways to get there, but they all mean you look at the world and you look at self and you start to notice things about the world and self that don't appear to be explainable by only referring to physical matter and chance. There's enough complexity, enough specificity, enough magic that you go big and you say, hey, there's a God. Now, you're either going to go big and you're going to say, hey, there's some really cool math that's behind the world. The law of electromagnetism and the law of gravity and strong nuclear force that holds atoms together and the weak nuclear force that makes them degrade. And Planck's constant and Maxwell's laws. You're going to get to know all of these laws, but you have to keep in mind that when you say the law of gravity, what you're really saying is there's a magical feature of reality that objects attract one another. Where does that come from? I don't know. It's just magic. It just is. And so even if you refer to physical laws as your apex, where everything came from, those physical laws become somewhat godlike. They're physical, but they're eternal, and they're constant, and they give rise to everything. And so really what you're left with is either A, the source of existence either looks a lot like a math formula, or the source of all existence looks a lot like a mathematician. But it's going to be one of the two, because the world follows these rules. So there's either a rule maker, or at the apex there's a set of rules. That's what you were trying to say. You weren't that far off. And you gave a specific instance. You were seeming to be going for the irreducibility of consciousness. I don't want you guys to just understand what you said, which is the irreducibility of consciousness. I don't even want you to do it in my exact language. I rather want you to do what you did, which is to understand the basic nature of the argument. This would be where I want you to not say exactly what I said. I want you to say it in your own words. You look at the stuff that's out there in the world. It's just stuff, right? And you're also stuff. So we could use the word stuff for us and the world. You're looking at stuff, and there are things about that stuff that can't be explained just by physicalism, just by materialism, just by reference to math. What kind of things? Well, the perfect fine-tuning of the universe, our distance from the sun, how all the constants of the universe work at just the right level to support life, the miracle of life itself, consciousness. And those features of the manifest universe I'm looking at and trying to understand philosophically, those features of the universe are such that it makes me realize that there must be a source, a conscious source. And now you're starting to get into a God, a mathematician, instead of just a mathematical formula. Did you follow that argument? You get it? If you try to say it, you will fail. But if you don't try to say it, you'll never get good at it. So you got to keep doing what you did. You went from an F to a D. Imagine what happened if you tried the argument 10 more times. You'd start to move from a D to a C to a B, and that's starting to get pretty darn respectable. So, Krishna introduced a theology, and in that theology, he said you could remember him at the time of death. Arjuna then, imagine if I said to you, and once you've really figured it out, you will make sure to so once you've really figured it out, you will make sure to always drink enough electrolytes. Once you really figure it out, you will make sure that you always drink enough electrolytes. Electrolytes are things like sodium and potassium and magnesium that are required for the proper functioning of your body. They carry an electric charge. And so minerals that carry an electric charge, and therefore they're important for muscle function and brain function. And when you get dehydrated, a lot of times what's happening is you're getting your electrolytes depleted. And that's why it's critical that you drink enough electrolytes along with drinking enough water, because either one of them, if you just drink water without replenishing, you'll have a problem. So you need to salt your food. If you look at farmers, like my father grew up on a farm, and they would break a watermelon on the farm, but they would always carry salt in their pocket, and they would put salt on the watermelon. So they were drinking the watermelon along with sodium, and that sodium then made sure they didn't deplete their electrolytes. They were working out on the farm in Missouri in the hot sun. You follow? Okay. So once you've understood, what are you going to do? Drink enough electrolytes. You got it? Right? It's a conditional clause. If you've understood, then you'll drink enough electrolytes. It's a parallelism. If, then. You follow? Okay. It's a conditional statement. All right. So, then, 1 minute later, because that's how much time has passed, I said that to you, and then you say back to me, right? And how will it happen that I will make sure to drink enough electrolytes? You follow? Does that make sense? It's very clear that you're remembering what I've said a minute ago, and you're asking me a follow-up question about what I said previously, having accepted what I said previously. You follow? So, in the last chapter, Krishna said, and after you've understood all these concepts, you will be able to remember me at the time of death. And then Arjuna says, it's a little more complicated than what I did. I'll give you a simple one. It's just slightly more complicated. But now that we've done the simple one, you'll be able to appreciate the more complicated one. And then Arjuna starts the next chapter by going, and who is the Adi Yagya? And how will I be able to remember him at the time of death? Krishna just said, once you understand all these terms, you'll be able to remember me at the time of death. And Arjuna goes, who's the Adi Yagya who's in this body, and how will I be able to remember him at the time of death? Now, if we're talking about the Adi Yagya who's in the body, who exists in our body? Who exists in the body? Who exists in the body? I mean, you guys are really starting to look stupid. Huh? Don't try and get too fancy. It's just a simple answer. Who exists in your body, dummy? Who? You. Come on. Who exists in your body? You exist in your body. You, the soul, you. That's the first answer. Don't go getting all fancy with Brahman or this or that. You exist in your body. Who exists in your body? There you go. Us, you, me. Okay, good. Any of those win. All right. Who also exists in the body alongside you, Howard? There you go. You don't have to say Paramatma. Don't have to say Super Soul. Don't have to say the Oversoul. You can just say God. Who exists in the body? You. Who else exists? God. So when Krishna says, who is the Adi Yagya existing in the body? When Arjuna says this, who could he be referring to? Us or God? You follow? Are you guys with me? Because you're really not seeming like you're with me. I mean, this is easy stuff. I'm like dying here. I'm getting disturbed now. When Arjuna says, who's the Adi Yagya, who's existing in the body? Who could that refer to? Self or God. There you go. Right? And then he says, and how can I remember him at the time of death? Now, should we remember the self at the time of death? Yes. Should we remember God at the time of death? Yes. So it doesn't actually tell you which one it is. What tilts the scale in the favor of Krishna is not the answer where Krishna says, I'm the Adi Yagya, which he says in 3 verses. That's not what tilts the scale. But when he says, how can I remember him at the time of death? Krishna just said, and you will remember me at the time of death. You follow? Krishna said, you'll remember me at the time of death in the last chapter. Then Arjuna says, how will I remember him? Who's the him? It's Krishna. Therefore, the Adi Yagya is Krishna. Even in Arjuna's question, he's indicating the Adi Yagya is Krishna. Did you guys follow this? So it's like when you read these verses, there is a cadence. There is information being given. It's not that the text is completely devoid of meaning. There is the intended meaning of the author. It's not just that we ascribe meaning to the text. The text has a natural flow. And so you have to remember what was said a few verses ago because it comes up again, and Arjuna, he springboards off of what was said previously and asks follow-up questions that indicate he's understood the previous information such that the conversation can proceed and you're not always reinventing the wheel. So, who's in your body? Self and God. Therefore, when Arjuna says, who's the Adi Yagya, who could he be referring to? Self or God. You guys are really, you're not listening. Again, you're not listening. If you're listening, I'm saying 2 plus 2 equals 4. And I'm like, so 4 is? The only answer is 2 plus 2. I'm making it that easy for you guys. When Arjuna says, who is the Adi Yagya who's in the body and how is he in the body, who could he be referring to? I can't hear you. Self or God. Right? Okay. Then he says, now how can I remember the Adi Yagya? Who could you want to remember at the time of death? Self or God. Remembering self would also be good. Remembering you're a spiritual being would also be good. So what tilts it in the favor of, this is not about the self, it's about Krishna? Yes?
He says at the end of the 7th chapter that you remember me at the time of death.
There you go. And so Arjuna picks up on that and says, how can I remember him at the time of death? Indicating it's Krishna. Did you follow this?
Yeah.
Did you follow it a while ago?
No, I don't think so.
Did anybody follow this a while ago? Or did you guys all just get it now? You all just got it now. Okay. Because if any of you followed it a while ago, you'd be thinking, what is wrong with these people? It's like 2 plus 2 equals 4, and therefore 4 is? And you're like, Like, you got to be able to do that math, where 2 plus 2 equals 4, 4 is 2 plus 2. And you follow? And if you add 2 and 2, it's going to equal 4. If you divide 4 by 2, it's going to equal 2. You have to be able to do that level of arithmetic back and forth easily to show that you've mastered the subject, to show that you've understood the subject. Does this make sense? Without the ability to just repeat back as I'm leading you, it indicates that you're not even listening. You there? All right. So, 6 topics. Adhyatma, Adi Bhuta, Adi Daiva, Brahma, Kim, and Adi Yagya. 5 of them are what's this, and one of them is who's this, how's he in the body, and how can I remember it in time of death? That must be Krishna because of the last chapter. You're also going to find out it's Krishna in this chapter. Now, what does Adi Yagya mean literally? It means supreme soul. Excuse me, it means supreme sacrifice. My bad. Adhyatma means supreme soul. Adibhuta means supreme being. Adi means supreme or topmost or over or above. So like over soul. But the terms are not used in a literal sense here. These are philosophical terms which have multiple meanings in Sanskrit. Not all Sanskrit terms are like that. Many Sanskrit terms have one primary meaning, just like many terms in English. But every once in a while you come across a complicated term which is context dependent. And when you come across a context dependent term, then you have to really look at the language. These are Upanishadic terms that existed before the Gita was written. They were philosophical terms that were defined in the Upanishads in a variety of ways. And Krishna is now using that language of the old Upanishads, which were ancient texts at the time the Gita was spoken, and he's using them in a specific way to teach a theology. Now, he already taught us a theology in the 7th chapter, but now he's going to teach us a theology in Upanishadic terms. What is a theology, by the way? Yeah?
The relationship between the world, God, and self.
World, God, and self. 3 items, right? World, God, and self. That's a theology. And now we're going to encounter a theology in Upanishadic terms. This is important because it shows continuity. Like Christians want to show you that Jesus is the Messiah of Judaism. That when they predicted a Messiah would come, for example, in the book of Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible, that Jesus was the fulfillment of that prophecy. This is important for the Christians. They could have just said, there's a God, Jesus is son, he showed up, did A, B, and C, it's a miracle. But that's not the way they did it. They did it that, according to the Hebrew Bible, if you don't follow the laws of God, you have to die and suffer. And God requires a blood sacrifice in the Passover. You have to sacrifice a lamb to satisfy God. And then Jesus became that lamb and was sacrificed. And it was a great sacrifice on behalf of all of humanity, such that all of humanity became redeemed by Jesus' sacrifice. And their life was bought back by Jesus' dying on the cross. So they chose to connect the sacrifice of Jesus to the sacrifice of the Paschal Lamb in Judaism. And they chose to connect their Christian revelation to the pre-existing Jewish tradition. Therefore, it was important for them to find continuity and things in the Hebrew Bible that came to pass in the New Testament. And the big purpose of the New Testament is to show congruence and continuity from the Hebrew Bible and the pre-existing Jewish tradition and the Christian revelation. Do you guys follow this? Sometimes that's important. So Hinduism is the oldest continually practiced religion in the world. There may be older religion, but it died out. Then you get like neo-pagans or neo-Egyptian people, but there's no continuity. It died out completely and then got brought back. And so with Hinduism, you have an ancient tradition which has been continually practiced, and what that means is everybody commentates on the pre-existing tradition. They honor the pre-existing tradition and then add some bells and whistles. And then they honor that and add some bells and whistles. And that's, you can trace out the evolution of Hinduism through a bunch of different periods, but none of them decried or rejected the pre-existing tradition. They revived it or shined new light on it or had further revelations about it, etc., etc. But they didn't say this stuff was wrong. Are you guys following this? Okay. And so Krishna is framing out the theology he just taught us in the 7th chapter now in Upanishadic language, and the value of framing something out in the Upanishadic language, in the older language of the pre-existing tradition is what? It shows continuity. It shows you're not making something up. Sometimes they break. Buddhism broke. They said this is all bogus. We have a new thing going on. It wasn't really a new thing because they borrowed so many concepts from previous Hinduism, but they made it break from the Vedic literatures. And interestingly enough, Buddhists are now in Hinduism called Gnostic, atheists. Not because they don't believe in God, but because they rejected the Vedas. The Vedic tradition was a scriptural tradition with a sacred language, and it was really important that you were adhered to those sacred texts. And if you look at Manu, a famous philosopher, lawgiver in India, and you look at the Manavadharma Shastra, popularly known as the Manu Samhita, very, very ancient law book in India at the time before there was a distinction between church and state, you find that Manu introduces these terms Gnostic and Astic. Astic traditions are traditions which accept the Veda, and Gnostic traditions are traditions which don't accept the Veda. If you were an atheist but you believed in the Veda, you're not an atheist because you believe in the Veda, and that was enough, even if you didn't believe there was a God. If you believe in the God but you didn't accept the Vedas, you're an atheist, you're a Gnostic. And so they sank or swam based on adherence to the Veda. They're a very, very serious tradition of people who had adherence to a sacred body of literature. And so it's important to show your bona fides. It's important to show the legitimacy of your tradition. It's important to show continuity. Now, who is the author of the Upanishads, ultimately? Krishna. Therefore, what he's really doing in the Gita is he's commentating on his previous work. Does anybody ever, why do people commentate on their previous work? Why do people offer commentaries on their work?
To establish, when you do a thesis, you do references to an existing text, so it's like what you're saying.
But that's not what I asked. Why do people write auto commentaries? There's a name for it. It's called an auto commentary. Why do people write a commentary on their own work?
Because the audience.
So you're saying why people write a commentary on others' work. Your references are to a pre-existing, but you didn't write those previous books. You cite them. You don't cite your own work. I mean, you might, but you cite other people's works as well, and you build on pre-existing tradition. You follow? But I'm asking why you would write an auto commentary, and those do exist, especially in the Sanskrit tradition. Why?
Perhaps because the audience didn't fully understand who they.
That could be it. Maybe you want to write a poetic work, which was somewhat concise and sutra-like. It was aphorisms. It was tight. It was condensed. Codes and corollaries. And then you write a commentary on those codes and corollaries. This happens oftentimes with a legal judgment. They will pass a judgment. The judgment will be very, very short. And then they will write a commentary on that judgment. There's a name for it. A dissent is if they don't agree with the judgment and they got outvoted. But there's sometimes they'll write explanatory notes. I can't remember what the term is. It's used in legal circles. But they'll write a long-winded, sometimes 100, 200 pages of commentary on what they wrote that was very concise. They might write a judgment that's only 1 or 2 pages. Then they might write, each one of the judges might then write something formal that's dozens of pages, even scores of pages, even hundreds of pages, explaining how they came to their conclusion. And so sometimes it's elegant to say things relatively short and tight and concise. And then sometimes if people misunderstood, you got to go back and commentate on it. Sometimes if you have some further revelation you want to give, maybe you want to warm them up by telling them something. Have you ever had, like when you tell somebody they have cancer and they're going to die in 6 weeks, the first day you tell them you might have cancer. Then a few days later, after you biopsy their tissue, you say you do have cancer. It might be terminal. Then the next day you say it is terminal. You might not have long to live. And then the next day you say you've got 6 weeks to 8 weeks to live. this happens. You don't tell it all to them at one time because it's too much information. So you have a schedule and you tell them bits and pieces, and the truth is revealed gradually. Not because you didn't understand it the whole time, but because you want to have some bedside manner and you want to break it to people gently. They couldn't understand it all. If you have children and they ask you questions, sometimes you'll give an answer to a 5-year-old. It's be very different than how you'd answer that same question 10 years later when your son or daughter asks you again at the age of 15. Because their mind has developed so much more, you can tell them so much more. And so Krishna, having explained the Upanishads and now giving more detail on what those Upanishads were ultimately teaching, it's perfectly reasonable. It's very Hindu to do an auto-commentary. Happens all the time in our tradition, where one of our theologians will write a book and then they'll write a commentary on the book. In fact, all of our major texts written by our medieval authors are written like this, where there's commentaries on what they wrote, that they wrote. They wrote the book and then they wrote the commentary on the book. Okay. So, 6 terms. What, who, and how. Last one was who and how. So we get a sense, Adi Yagya must be Krishna. And that would be the supreme person to whom sacrifices are made. That's how you would understand Adi Yagya. All right, here we go. You guys ready? We're going over it again. Here we go. Aksharam Brahma Paramam. Brahman is the supreme, undecaying, the supreme, unchanging, indestructible. That's actually better. I like indestructible over undecaying. So, what is Brahman? It's the indestructible. What's indestructible? The soul and God. So it's one of those two. What are we going to favor here? The soul. Why are we going to favor the soul? Because God's already taken by Adi Yagya. You get it? If Adi Yagya is Krishna, then Brahman should be the soul. You get it? Makes sense, doesn't it? Right? Alright, let's keep going. Swabhava Dhyatma Uchate. Swabhav is Adhyatma. What does Swabhav mean? One's own nature. Swabhav. Your own. Swa means your own being, your own nature. Yes. Is Swabhav used to indicate one's ultimate spiritual nature in Hindi? Is Swabhav, do you speak Hindi?
Yes.
Would you use the term Swabhav in Hindi to describe someone's ultimate spiritual nature as a soul? You don't know or no? You speak Hindi?
I understand where he's coming from, because in colloquial language, when you use the word svabhav to just say that is your innate nature.
That's right. Not your spiritual nature, not your ultimate nature. Your material conditioning, right? That's right. And that's exactly how the term is being used here and how the term is used throughout the Gita. Swabhav, bhuta, bhava, udbhava, kada. So, Swabhav is Adhyatma, which causes, kada, the creating, udbhava, of your bhuta bhava, of your conditional nature, as a being in this world. Bhuta here means a material being. Bhava means the nature of material beings. Udbhava means arising. So it's what causes to arise your conditional nature. So Swabhava is being used here in exactly the same way it's used colloquially. You got it? So the soul is indestructible, but it takes on a destructible nature when it joins itself to a body because of its adhyatma, its swabhav, its tendency to identify with material things, and that's what creates your bodies that you occupy. And that's how the soul, which is indestructible, becomes implicated temporarily in this material world, which is destructible. Did you follow that? I'm going to say it again. I made sense. I'm listening to myself talk, and that made sense. Let me say it again. Just listen more carefully. The soul is indestructible. Why can't we say that the indestructible refers to Krishna, JC? Took too long to answer. Why can't we say it? I know Shri knows the answer. Why can't we say it, Pavan?
We're already referring to God with Adi.
There you go. Adi Yag is taken. So we're like investigators. So although Brahman could be the soul or God, here we're going to go with the soul because Adi Yag is God. All right. Now what happens to our soul that's indestructible? What happens to your soul that's indestructible?
It becomes implicated.
It becomes implicated in this material world, right? How does that happen?
It identifies with matter.
It identifies with matter. What's one word in Sanskrit to indicate the soul's tendency to identify with matter according to this verse? Swabhav. What's that? What word are we using in Sanskrit for that? Adhyatma. Therefore, adhyatma is swabhav. Swabhav is the tendency to identify with the material world. It causes, kada, the arising, udbhava, of your bhuta bhava, your identification with matter. Why you look confused?
I'm just comparing between Adhyatma versus Swabhav. So,
This verse says Adhyatma is Swabhav. It literally defines Adhyatma as Swabhav. So you don't have to compare them because they're being defined by Krishna as being synonymous. Do you follow? Do you understand? If I say cold is below this certain temperature, and you're like, I'm trying to understand what the difference is between cold and below a certain temperature. There is no difference. It's literally being given as the definition. And I'm not using the word literally the way you guys use the word literally. I'm using the word literally to literally mean that is the definition given by Krishna as he's defining these terms. You following this? What?
Okay, I have a question. So if our soul...
Are you a soul?
Yes.
Are you in a body?
Yes.
You seem to be getting old.
Yes.
Are you ultimately getting old?
Yes. Not my body. I mean, not me.
Are you ultimately, notice the word ultimately,
No.
are you ultimately getting old?
No.
Does it seem like you're getting old?
Yes.
Okay, but it says here that you are akshar. You are indestructible. Do you appear to be getting destroyed?
Yes.
That's right. How does that happen that an indestructible soul appears to be getting destroyed?
Because I'm associated with the body.
Bingo. And so we have to explain that as we're explaining a theology. Does that make sense?
I just get confused because that adhyatma, if that's the same as swabhav, so that implies that it's not destructible.
Well, that's the whole thing that any theistic system has to explain, which is how a soul, which is pure and part of God's nature, becomes implicated in this world in a body. It doesn't have to be explained. Is that important to explain?
Yeah.
And so we're being told what the mechanism for that is. Now, this doesn't satisfy your question. Your question is going to be, what is it? Well, it's your free will. You turned away from divinity, and therefore there had to be a way for that to happen. And that's on you. It's not on God. And ultimately, the soul has free will, and it has freedom, and therefore it has a nature of being able to make such choices, and you chose to turn away from Krishna. But you can't ultimately turn away from Krishna because you're connected to Krishna inexorably as your fundamental nature, but you apparently turned away from Krishna. Does that make sense? You following?
I think so, yes.
So that answers your question. But Krishna didn't say that here. He's just saying, I'm just giving you literally what he's saying. So he's introducing adhyatma as the mechanism which causes akshar to identify with the material body. You follow? And visarga karma sangyitaha. That it is known as karma, that thing which creates your body. So your body is created by karma. That's another one. Now what's your original karma? What's your original karmic act? To turn away from Krishna. Then what happens subsequently? You make a bunch of other karmic acts, and that perpetuates your existence in this world. Does that make sense? So you see how it's making sense? And what's happening here is we're getting a theology. We got God, we have self, and we have the self's relationship to this world. You get it? What's the next thing we have to define? We define the self's relationship to the world, we haven't defined the world. The next verse defines the world. Adibhuta ksharabhava. The Adibhuta creates the nature of destructible things. In other words, your body. So now you have yourself. Yourself is known as Brahman. Right? And what is Brahman? It's Akshar. And what does Akshar mean? It's indestructible. Bingo. But what happened? You seem to become implicated in destructiveness, right? So how does that happen? Through Swabhav. And what does Swabhav do? It creates your conditional nature. And how is that perpetuated? Through karma. And what's the manifestation of that? Your ksharabhava, your destructible nature, which is most elegantly represented by your body and mind. You got it? There you go. And then Purusha, cha adidaivata. And now the Purusha is the adidaiva. Now you got a few different options here. Purusha could be, because Purusha means male, Purusha also means soul, and Purusha, like if you go to an Indian bathroom and you want to distinguish between whether it's a man's bathroom or a woman's bathroom, you will look for a sign on the door that says male or female. What does the sign indicate it's a men's bathroom? Purush. And what's the sign that indicates it's a woman's bathroom? Stri, which means expansion, by the way. So like is a somewhat derogatory term. And so, but Purush. And so it could mean male, it could also mean soul, and Purush could also mean God, and Purush could also be theoretically the demigods. Now if you want to say Purush means the soul, which is distinct from the material nature, then you have to say Brahman is God. You get it? Or you could say Brahman is spirit. And then Purush is a particular manifestation of spirit, namely you. What most of the commentators do here is they say that the Purush here is referring to the demigods or the universal form of Krishna that oversees the material world, because the material world still requires some overseeing and some, you follow? So now you're left with, you got 6, right? And we want to get a theology out of this, right? So Adi Yagya, we know from the outset, is Krishna. Brahman is you. You get implicated in this material world. That's Swabhav. That's perpetuated by karma. Creates a body. And then all those bodies and all those material things in this world are all ruled by higher powers. And that's the Adidaiva. That would be like the demigods or the universal form. And then finally you have the Adi Yagya. Adi Yagya aham evatra dehe deha vritam vada. And the Adi, I am the Adi Yagya existing in the body. And therefore Krishna identifies himself with the Adi Yagya. Now what's amazing here, and we're going to finish with this, is a theology, a philosophy must explain self and world. A theology explains self and world and reasons that there's a God behind both of them. Krishna is attempting to connect the theology he just outlined in the 7th chapter with the pre-existing tradition, and he uses a number of terms to do that. And those terms identify Adi Yagya, God, Adi Bhuta, world, and Brahman, soul. 3 things. You follow? And the Adi Yagya maintains the world through the Adi Daiva, through the demigods, or through time. We are connected to the world through karma, right? And our Swabhav, right? And then the last thing that's not stated here, and there's 2 of them there. We're connected by Swabhav and karma to this world. And then the last thing that's not stated is our relationship to Krishna, right? But that's been explained in the whole chapter. It's through bhakti. And in fact, the next verse will say, and whoever at the end of his life quits his body remembering me alone, at once attains my nature. Of this there's no doubt. And so now you have this idea of bhakti and remembering God and connecting with God. And so you now have a triangle. God, world, self. We're connected to the world through our turning away from God, our nature, and as well as through our karma. God's connected to the world through overseeing it as the demigods or as time. And we can be connected to God through remembering him, also known as bhakti. And so you have the three major points of a theology, along with the interfacing of those points. And so although we're talking in very, very old language, Krishna's explained that old language in such a way that supports the theology he's just taught in the 7th chapter. You see that? It's good, right? Thank you, IGTV. All right, feedback. Yes. And by the way, you guys, it might seem like